reminds us. Sometimes that's hidden in America. The majority of the world understands this. Randall Robinson knows it from what he's seen in his work in Africa, that the majority of the globe still experiences flood and famine and disease and war. Their lives are stained with calamity. And they know the desperation that a parent feels that their child might not survive. But that's on distant shores, and so we don't spend a lot of time thinking about it. Here in the United States, there are parents who feel that same desperation, because the faces of New Orleans weren't just the faces of New Orleans, they were the faces of the south side of Chicago and Anacostia. They're the faces of Harlem and the faces of Compton. And in those communities every day there are parents who, when their child leaves home from school, they are not certain whether those children will come home. They understand how fragile life can be. The other thing that a calamity like this reminds us of is that the order that we take for granted, everything that we assume, is based not just on technology, it's not just based on cell phones and computers and skyscrapers, but it's based on a certain human ecology. It's based on the very simple concept that I have regard for you, that I can see the world through your eyes, that I can imagine standing in your shoes. You know, after the hurricane and its aftermath, there was a lot of discussion about the fact that those who were impacted by the achingly slow response on the part of the federal government were disproportionately black. And one of my favorite musicians, that's right, I'm 44, but I still can hang, Kanye West, said on a telethon, George Bush doesn't care about black people. And that also shook up the ordinary. NBC scrambled and they had to. Mike Myers was standing there. He's usually a funny guy, but he didn't have a witty comeback for that one. He was looking like somebody had just made a bad smell or something. I love Kanye's music, but I actually disagreed with how he phrased his statement. And I said this on a Sunday talk show last week. I said, I do not ascribe to the White House or to FEMA, to Mr. Chertoff or Mr. Brown, any active malice. I don't think that they were in there plotting and saying, you know what, these are black people, let's not rescue them. But rather, what was revealed was a passive indifference that is common in our culture, common in our society, a sense that, of course, once the evacuation order is issued, that you will hop in your SUV and fill it up with $100 worth of gasoline and load up your trunk with some sparkling water and take your credit card and check in to the nearest hotel until the storm passes. And the notion that folks couldn't do that simply did not register in the minds of those in charge. And it's not surprising that it didn't register, because it hasn't registered for the last 6, 7, 8, 20, 50, 75, 100 years. The incompetence was colorblind. But what was important to understand was the fact that the people that we saw in front of the Superdome and in front of the Convention Center, they had been abandoned before the hurricane. They had been abandoned to dilapidated housing and inadequate schools, and the mayhem and violence and chaos that exists in inner city communities all across the country. You know, everybody talked about the looters and the snipers and those loops that played over and over again on CNN. But I mentioned to somebody the other day, what I would love to see after the waters have been pumped out of New Orleans and folks have been relocated and the rebuilding process has begun and the smell of death and decay has become scrubbed out of the Crescent City, I would love somebody to take a look at the statistics of homicide rates and sexual abuse in the 9th Ward of New Orleans before the hurricane struck. Because what you'll discover, in fact, is that the violence has always been there. It just wasn't on your television screens because it wasn't spilling out onto the lives of the rest of us. Now, I think that there's a certain danger of smugness and self-satisfaction on the part of those who didn't vote for George Bush. There's a certain sense of, I told you so. That this is a consequence of an ideological assault on the very idea of government that has been ascendant for too many years. And that the hollowing out of FEMA and the corruption and the cronyism that leads the head of the Arabian Horses Association to be in charge of our federal emergency response systems, that all of this was predictable. And I share the anger, and I share the outrage, but what I actually want to talk about is us accepting some responsibility. Because the truth is that we haven't been entirely on the case either. We've been a little complacent. We haven't displayed the sort of cool, focused outrage that a Charles Hamilton Houston displayed when the calamities of Jim Crow were occurring around him. We've been lulled into a certain apathy. And in fact, our anger at Bush and the administration lets us off the hook. It allows us to say, well, I didn't vote for him. I wrote John Kerry a check. And so as a consequence, this wasn't my problem. But of course it was our problem. Because the truth of the matter is that, you know, there is a lot of talk in this country about the federal deficit, and rightly so. We are extraordinarily irresponsible when it comes to thinking about future generations. And I am a party to it, being in Congress. There's a lot of legitimacy to the problem of the trade deficit. The fact that we're mortgaging our future to the Chinese Central Bank.